as you can clearly see, we are very live right now, which is highly exciting because we were just talking about how it's been nearly 2 years, maybe 2 years, maybe longer than 2 years, 2 and a bit years since we've done a proper live stream onto YouTube, onto South Bank's YouTube page. Nick, we now have 4 people watching. This is very exciting for me.
400% gain, 400.
We're up to 12. This is exponential growth. Everyone watching, we are just filling a little bit of time until midday when we promised we'd kick off. I am watching my clock, which actually just went to 12 noon, high noon. So we will get going in just a second. Thank you for the 18 people now watching. At this rate, Nick, we might be up to Mr. Beast levels by 12:15. So
it's like that.
Who knows how this is going to go?
It's like that when the water in the stadium doubles, you know, that there's a little puddle for the first however many hours, and then in the last 5 seconds it fills up.
Or like, I know some people that have probably seen a lot of content from South Bank and maybe some of our promotions that have gone out. Remember the chess set with the grain of rice, and if you double the grain of rice as you walk around the chess set, by the time you get to the end, it's more grains of rice than there are grains of sand on Earth. But anyway, all right. So we'll just give it another minute for the 18 people, which has now become, oh, there you go, 27. See, we're racking them up at great speed. All right. Well, let's crack on, Nick, because it is now 12:15, and we did promise we would kick off at high noon. So unfortunately, that people who haven't joined us at this point will be able to catch up down the track. But thank you, everyone, for tuning in. I'm Sam Volkering, editor at South Bank Investment Research, here with my good friend and colleague and editor of, I've lost track of how many publications you do, Nick, but definitely the lead at Fortune and Freedom. Thanks for joining us. For people that don't really know, maybe me, or, I mean, you should know Nick, to be honest, but I've known Nick. Has it been a decade now, mate? I think. About a decade?
Yeah, just over a decade, I suspect, because I remember your advice to get me to buy Bitcoin so early on in its existence. So that's how I measure how long I've known you. We're in the Bitcoin cycle. But
yeah, that's how most people measure me. How long ago it was that I told them to buy Bitcoin. But anyway, we're here not to talk about Bitcoin today. We're here to talk about nuclear energy. I am a massive proponent for it. I think it is the answer to our energy future. And that's not just in the UK. I think that's globally. And, you know, being an Australian by birth, I'm regularly dumbfounded at the lack of nuclear energy policy out there. And we might touch on that a little bit later. But Nick, you don't necessarily agree with me at, I guess, the nuclear policy and nuclear energy being as clean cut as it is the answer for us. And the title, obviously, of this live stream is Why Nuclear Can't Save Us Now, which for me is like, Nick, what are you talking about? You've blown my little mind already. So let's dive into the questions. I've got some questions I've prepared here that I want to ask you about because they are important and I want your take on it. And I think our readers and our viewers today want to know because it's everywhere. Nuclear energy is in the news. It's important, but it may not be the answer. So when we look at a country like France, right? France, obviously nuclear makes great sense to them. They are a nuclear-based system already and have been for quite some time. You think that adding nuclear to the energy grid in a similar fashion is not going to work for the UK? Dissect. Go.
Yeah, this is just as awkward for me as it is for you because I'm a big believer and nuclear is the answer and nuclear is a silver bullet. I agree with all that. What I want to try and do here is make a case along a particular line of argument to see what the readers make of it, to try and get you guys to comment below or even during the live stream to tell me where I'm wrong, where have I got this wrong? Because if I'm right, if this theory is right, then it has some serious implications for the Fleet Street Letter portfolio for a start. And for our editorial, of course, in the future. So bear with me with the argument to see what you make of it. I'm a big fan of nuclear. Sam's a big fan of nuclear. We're arguing against nuclear in this video. The basic idea is very simple. sure, nuclear is great for France, and we should have gone to nuclear a long time ago. The problem is that we've sort of gone a few steps down this road, or many steps now, down this road towards renewable energy. And that is why nuclear no longer makes sense for the UK. Even a small amount doesn't make sense. So there's two real reasons for why this is the case, despite the fact that nuclear seems like this wonderful silver bullet. The first reason is that nuclear's great benefit, the big promise of nuclear, is that it saves us from having to spend ridiculous amounts of money on electricity infrastructure and the backup grid and all these high voltage cables and batteries and energy storage and all of these other bizarre things that we need because of renewables, right? So when all these think tanks, they estimate what's the cost of renewables, they don't include the fact that you have to build all this other stuff in order to make renewables viable. Nuclear's big benefit is, look, it's clean and it's green. We don't have to build all that crazy stuff. We don't have to connect Scotland to the southern England. We don't have to have all these batteries everywhere. We don't need to figure out hydrogen. We don't need all these crazy things that we need under a renewable system. We don't need those. And that's the big promise of nuclear. That's why, despite the fact that nuclear is expensive to build, despite the fact that it's expensive to run, despite the fact that you've got to get rid of the waste, all of these things don't matter because the alternative of renewables is just so expensive. And we can get rid of all that by going to nuclear. But when you're making that comparison, you can't just say that. You can't just say, well, look, if we had if we had a nuclear grid at 70% of power supply, we wouldn't need all this other stuff. The grid we've got, the one that you actually need to look at to consider should we add some nuclear, is already so far down this path towards renewables that adding nuclear now wouldn't save us all that money, right? All of this benefit of nuclear of not having to spend all this money on infrastructure, we can't negate that anymore. We're going to have to do it. There's so much renewable energy in our energy system that we need those cables, we need those batteries, we need that storage, we need all of these things. So nuclear doesn't solve that problem. We're going to be saddled with those costs regardless. And so nuclear is just going to be another form of expensive energy that's sitting on this messy grid competing with renewables. The second reason is probably more important to nuclear investors, especially if you're interested in the actual power production and the companies that sell the nuclear energy. We're in a situation now where renewables are, in some cases, in some countries, providing enough electricity on some days when they're at peak production for the entire country, right? So even in some cases, more than 100% of what's needed. So if we start adding nuclear, what's going to happen there? It means nuclear is not going to be producing at its capacity all the time. It's going to be producing when it's not sunny and it's not windy, right? And that really makes nuclear a bad option because its fixed costs are really, really high. So the only way you can make nuclear cheap is if you're running it, gung-ho all the time, not all the time, 90% of the time is about the estimate. If you're running it constantly like that, it becomes quite cheap. But if you're only running it about half the time when there's no wind and sun, then all of a sudden the cost per unit of energy produced is actually quite high. And you would have been much better off going with an alternative such as gas and coal, I would argue, but I'm sure green believers would say batteries or whatever it is. That alternative makes more sense in terms of cost than renewables. So renewables and nuclear, they're chalk and cheese. You can't match them well together. Like this is, if we think about the energy grid and supply being like a puzzle, right? The two pieces don't fit together. You can have gas and renewables fit together. You can have 70% nuclear and a bit of residual other stuff. But if you're trying to go with some say 30% nuclear and 70% renewables, those two specifically don't fit well together. They leave you with a high cost, bizarre, messy system where someone's going to have to go without. You've either got to decide to pay the nuclear power plant for all of their energy all the time, which severely disadvantages renewables, or vice versa. You've got to prioritize the energy provided by renewables so they get the revenue, and nuclear is left with these huge costs, but they're not actually producing that much electricity all the time. So between those two issues, the fact that it's not going to save us much money on infrastructure and the fact that it is going to be high cost once you factor in we only need it when renewables are not producing, nuclear suddenly starts to look like a less good option.
what's okay? So I get where you're coming from, and the idea of these big nuclear plants being constructed and built and connecting to the grid is there are clearly issues with cost, connectivity mix with the existing infrastructure and existing energy mix. But does that change when you start to think of some of the work being done and you look at a company like Rolls-Royce as a particular example on small modular reactor technology, which some argue is never going to happen and some argue is too expensive now, and there's all these issues which once were the same arguments leveled at renewable energy until it became a regular part of the energy grid, where you start to see these smaller modular reactors, the SMRs, not necessarily connecting to the overall grid, but creating their own microgrids for communities or attached to a data center. Does that change your view on the direction this heads? If we're not talking about, Hinkley Point C, we're talking about Google's data center being powered by its own SMR. Does that change things at all for you?
Yeah, massively. So I would regard that as a completely different sort of investment thesis and theme. In fact, I would regard it as the ultimate solution here. So anyone who's a large power consumer, which if you think about communities and townships and so on and so forth, they now, through this SMR technology, have the opportunity to say, look, the national government has made such a mess of this energy transition in the energy system. We can't rely on them. It's unreliable. It's high cost. Even adding nuclear won't solve this problem. We're going to go our own way. We're going to do our own thing. And we're going to build our own power supply. And we're not going to connect it to the grid, right? Because then, the entire benefit is sort of interfered with in the sense that you have to, produce your power and sell it in this grid. And Australian solar producers are learning what the consequences of that are right now because they're being taxed for producing electricity, from their rooftop solar, which is an interesting new policy. But the point is that the SMR technology, what makes it great and unique is its size. So it's purchasable by a power user. One way to think about this is that until now, companies have built their own buildings, they've hired their own staff, they've used, got their own machinery in-house. Well, why don't they produce their own power? And obviously, like your neighborhood carpenter is not going to do that. But my point is that a large company or a small town or a mid-sized town or a city could do that. They could, through this SMR technology, decide, we're going to get 8 of these SMRs, which means we can run maintenance on one at any given time, of course. And through this, they become independent and they have a fixed source of power at a fixed cost. They know what's happening. They're controlling it themselves. That side of nuclear would be the solution to the fact that if we're not going to have nuclear in the UK for the reasons I'm arguing in this video, we're going to be in trouble because the energy transition is such a mess, as we see in places like Germany, especially. So that, it's kind of ironic that nuclear is the way out of this mess, just at a smaller scale, at a scale, you can think of it like privatized power. The irony of nuclear being a solution to the problem of not being able to add nuclear to the grid because the grid is so messed up. But I think that story is quite separate as an investment thesis to the one where, uranium demand's going to boom, or, these big companies producing this big nuclear fuel. I think the investment thesis for SMRs is quite distinct from that in many ways. You'd be much better off going with a company that has these SMRs or is developing these SMRs and is going to sell them, rather than these more traditional ways of investing in nuclear energy, like the big companies or the uranium stocks. So I'd caution people to separate the two.
Is the big problem that you see with it, though, is it a private industry problem or is this a government policy problem? Like, let's be frank here. With the Labor government in power, and I'm reading this morning that there's talk that they are going to go down a tax route on dry wealth, so to speak. So your house, your property, they're coming for that, according to certain views and opinions online. So, increases in wealth tax, complete change to the council tax system. some of the talk around the world at the moment about even tax on unrealized gains is phenomenally disturbing. We've now got a Labor government that is run by probably the most mediocre personality I've ever seen in politics, which isn't probably a bad thing. It is probably suitable for Britain's climate, so to speak, right now, compared to at least the shit show that's been for the last 4 years. Sorry for the free language, everyone, but we are definitely live here. Does Labor and Starmer, does this sink the sword into the chest of nuclear in the UK? Is Labor the death knell for nuclear energy connecting to the UK grid and helping to reduce the cost of energy for people, which is still astronomically high in the UK?
Yeah, I think they're paying lip service to nuclear without actually doing anything about it, because they've got no incentive to. There's that wonderful Nick Clegg video saying, nuclear is not going to solve anything for 20 years. And that video was recorded 20 whatever years ago. It would have been just in time for the energy crisis of 2022. But the point is that Labor has no incentive to push this nuclear stuff. They're very much part of the renewables focus. And I think it's a renewables focus, not a climate focus, by the way. I think they're very much focused on their lobbyists and the industry rather than actually cutting emissions, as we see through all sorts of different evidence. We saw it with the airport, the London City Airport decisions. But the point I would make on this, all people, voters, investors, everyone should keep in mind is that the climate change net zero story is so all-encompassing in every aspect of our life, and it is so completely arbitrary in how it's interpreted, that it gives governments a sort of catch-all, control or power over every element of our life. So bizarrely enough, they can decide that a renewable energy project is not good for the environment, as the Australian government did a few months ago, which completely confused everyone. But then they can say, an airport expansion, that's great news, we should do that. But this lens of everything needing to be seen through climate change means it's become completely arbitrary. And so governments now have a level of control over our lives that they haven't had before, through this back door almost, to this default legitimization of, it's all about climate change and net zero, and therefore you can't argue against it. And that means some unusual things could actually happen. Some of the protections and the common sense that you might have presumed would prevail over the last few years, a lot of those are built around the fact that no one's going to agree to it. But as soon as you reference climate change, then all of a sudden all sorts of absurdities are accepted. And by the legal side of things with that Climate Change Act, also by politics and by activists and so on and so forth. And I think we need to start thinking about what is the government going to do that it couldn't previously, that it can now that there's this climate change furor. And I think that's why people are so upset about 15-minute cities, is because they sense that this is sort of a backdoor for all sorts of policies that they wouldn't want if they were openly pursued. But if you say we're going to have 15-minute cities, well, what does that actually mean? That's where the actual rubber meets the road. Or in this case, doesn't, ironically enough. But
and I think interpretation of some of those things often gets skewed to push particular agendas as well. Like, again, I think what it boils down to is in the UK and in every country really. If your people are not getting ripped off and if they're not being lied to, they're generally pretty happy. The problem is that politicians lie to them all the time, and people are getting ripped off for services supposed to be provided by the government and supposed to be supported by the government, and instead everything's just more expensive. So people are correctly really pissed off about the situation, and I completely get that. And this is why when people voted. The Labor government's there. They're probably not going to have a very good nuclear policy, but the others were so bad And herein lies the problem with the two-party political system. But anyway, that's another conversation for another day. And I should add, I'm looking off to the side here from time to time because we're getting some great questions coming in from our viewers as well, which we may not necessarily have time to touch on today, but certainly something to look at for another period in time. And we talk about government and we talk about Starmer and Labour as being, they're an important part of what's going to happen in the UK over the next, God, who knows how long they could be in power. But again, a topic for another discussion. Now, I know you've been working pretty hard on a new briefing that you were publishing out to our readers. As people watching who know us well are probably well aware, and you will not see on this live stream, we do not advertise external third parties or anything like that. At South Bank Research, we get our revenue coming in through the door for the people that want to pay for our research and insight recommendations, and piecing together the puzzle that helps you to ultimately be a better investor, be more switched on, understand the world and how it works better, and hopefully make some profits along the way as well. In doing that, I know you've got a new briefing, Nick, that is very much aimed at people's concerns and worries about a Starmer-led Labour and a Starmer-led Britain. And we've talked about some of the dangers and worries that people have already now that Labour's in power. But I don't think that people are necessarily getting the full picture as well, because we know the media gets manipulated towards the government of the day quite often. And there's a real threat to British investors that's even far more severe than what you might see in the Telegraph, for instance. Now, you're saying in your new briefing, which people can access now, I'm going to pop a link in the chat window here so that people can go and check this briefing out. I'm going to pop that there for people. I'm going to pop it twice because that's just the kind of person I am. Now, it's tied to this shadow currency that you talk about, that's been triggering every major financial panic over the last, half century and blowing up again. Do you want to have a brief chat to us about that? Tell us what your briefing's about and why people should bother going to see the link that I just put in the chat box.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are a bit sort of over the fact that we're getting all these warnings about Labour, and it's not the first Labour government the UK's ever had to get through. Some of them were pretty bad, admittedly, but I think we're at a new level. There's something else that's changed here, and it's not really about Labour as a government in and of itself. It's how fragile things are that makes a Labour government more dangerous than usual, significantly more dangerous. And it's a lesson that we've had repeatedly sort of taught to us the hard way. There's been these situations when the underlying fragility is what we should be blaming for what went wrong, rather than the first domino to fall. So, for example, I remember very clearly during the Asian financial crisis, when I was researching, I learned that the first domino was a Thai property developer called Somprasong Land and Development, or something like that. It defaulted on its bonds. And this was an insignificant, well, not insignificant, it was a small property developer in Thailand. And this just triggered this chain reaction, right? So everyone sort of, blamed Thailand and this particular property development company. But of course it was this, the dominoes had to be lined up. It's this fragility in the underlying system. It's the same through all these other crises. 2008, we shouldn't blame dodgy American mortgages or collateralized debt obligations. 2008, it was the fragility that it exposed almost. 2018, we had an Italian political crisis. Shouldn't be sending financial markets to the worst performance since 2008, but they did, which is totally bizarre. And then, of course, 2022, we had the liability-driven investments drama. Strange derivative positions taken by pension funds shouldn't be causing the government to get booted out of office. So rather than focusing on what triggers the crisis in a given point in time, because usually it's something bizarre and obscure that nobody saw coming or even understood from the outset, people should be focusing on the fragility of the underlying system. And that fragility is extremely high at the moment because of things like debt and derivatives and financialization, all these sorts of other issues, some of which we discuss in that shadow currency presentation. But the thing that we've identified in that presentation is the common denominator. It is this, what is behind the fact that all these systems were so fragile that it only took a small Thai property developer to kick things off, or some defaults in American subprime mortgages to kick things off. What do they all have in common? What is this nature of this fragility, the source of this fragility in the first place? And I can't give away what it is, without a full explanation, so people should watch that shadow currency presentation. But if you're wondering, why does the entire system, in 2022, the entire pension system was close to going bust. And according to Theresa May, the UK government might have struggled to fund itself as a result, according to some recent interviews. Why is the system so fragile? Why does it only take, the yen falling however many percent or rising however many percent in order to cause this massive meltdown in financial markets? What is that fragility caused by? And that's what we talk about in that presentation.
Yeah, you know what? When you mentioned fragility, all I can think of is the Bank of Japan rising their rates by 0.2%, and the market completely shitting itself. I mean, you want to talk about fragility, folks? That's your example of how fragile the entire system is right now. So yeah, by all means, everyone, make sure you jump in and check out Nick's briefing. I'm going to post the link again because that's 3 times a charm. I want to thank a bunch of people, from Roger making comments here, Andy, John, Lorenzo, Charles, W2 class, which I'm guessing is not your real name. Johnny, TCPIP. What a handle that is. I love that, even though you just put an emoji in there, kind of. And Christine, thanks for making comments. We'll try and touch on some of those issues, I think, down the track. Again, Nick, you mentioned something about pensions. I saw just the other day about the spike and huge rise in unfunded pensions, which I think is a whole nother topic of discussion for another day, which I think we'll jump onto. But we've been going for about half an hour now. So we're going to wrap it up. Nuclear, again, the situation with nuclear and the development of it, plugging into the grid, if it mixes with renewables, again, is this example of the fragility of not just the financial system, but our social systems, how the government works, how it connects with private enterprise. So it is a precarious state, and I can appreciate why a lot of people are worried and concerned, but there are ways through this mess. There always have been ways through the mess that's created by those in power that speak for themselves and quite often not for everyone else. And that's what we hope to unpack and unpick and help you through here at South Bank Research. So I want to thank everyone for jumping on the live stream today. We are definitely doing more of these because I get to occasionally swear, and I just think it's a lot more fun. So thanks, Nick, for joining us. I know the time zone's a bit iffy for you. It'll probably be a bit iffy for me soon. I'm moving again, folks, but that's another conversation. Any final closing remarks you want to leave our viewers with today, Nick?
I feel like we've got to take one question at least. Give me a curly one on nuclear.
All right. In 10 years' time, Nick, will we see more nuclear energy in the British grid, or the same or less?
I think it's projected to fall over time at the moment, and I don't think any decision will make a difference within 10 years. It's possible that we'll start building or not building, planning to increase it over the next 10 years, which means it might actually show up another 10 years after that or 15 years after that. So I think that turning point, which is the part investors should focus on, could come in the next 10 years. But I'm worried this issue that I've laid out today about pairing renewables and nuclear will actually come to dominate, not just in the UK, by the way, but globally. The electricity engineers will say, no, it's too late to add nuclear. You've put too much renewables in the system. The two don't work together. And I'm worried that will completely pull the rug out from underneath investment in nuclear power in places that have already gone too far down that path. So, China or whatever, they're expanding so much of it. It works quite well. It's places like the UK and Germany that are going to miss out on this nuclear boom.
All righty. Well, there you go. You heard it from Nick. Thanks, folks, for joining us. If you've got any comments, leave them in the comments. Blue feedback, anything, welcome. We'll do another live stream again. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.